My name is Lauren Whitaker. I'm 29 years old and I live in Savannah, Georgia. On the night everything snapped, I had one thing on my mind. A specialist appointment I'd waited months for. It was circled on the calendar by the fridge. The one plan in that kitchen that was finally about me. Dinner was the usual noise before one of my little sister's shows. I was trying to finish my food and stay out of the way when she turned to me like I was a problem to fix. She didn't ask if I could move my appointment. She just decided my health was negotiable. "Cancel it. You're coming to my show," she said like it was already settled. When I said no, the silence hit harder than her voice. Forks stopped, and my parents stared like I'd broken a rule they never had to say out loud. My sister moved first. Her hand came across my face so fast my chair slid on the tile. My parents didn't pull her back. They didn't ask why I'd made that appointment or what I was worried about. They only reminded me this night mattered for her, and that a doctor could always wait, that my plans were the ones that could be erased. With my cheek burning, I finally understood what that meant. If I stayed, I was agreeing that my health and my future were optional. So I picked up my keys in my wallet, pushed my chair back, and walked out. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far the story will travel. By the time the sky over Savannah turned dark, I was still gripping the steering wheel like I'd forgotten how to let go. I didn't have a plan when I walked out of that house. I knew I wasn't going back in. My cheek throbbed, my jaw buzzed, and the word appointment kept flashing in my head like a warning light. For once in my life, I had circled a date for myself, not for anyone else, and I refused to move it again. There were two places I could go that night: a cheap motel off the highway or the one apartment in the city where I wouldn't be treated like a burden. I picked up my phone at a red light and stared at one name in my recent calls. Jordan Price and I had met at work a couple of years earlier. We both handled guest issues at a hotel on the riverfront, the kind of job where you smile for tourists all day and then go home too tired to talk. Somewhere between long shifts and late-night complaints, Jordan had become the only person in Savannah who ever asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. I didn't type out everything that had just happened at dinner. I didn't mention the slap or the way my parents had stared at me like I was selfish for wanting to see a specialist. I sent one short message asking if Jordan's offer from months ago still stood, the one about the couch being open if I ever needed to get out. The reply came back quickly, a simple confirmation and an apartment number. That was enough. I drove across town with the kind of numb focus you get when the breakdown has to wait. Walking into Jordan's building felt like stepping out of the role I'd been stuck in my whole life. No framed photos of my sister and dance costumes on the walls, no stack of bills on the counter with my name on them, no running list of errands taped to the fridge under my handwriting. Just quiet and the sound of my own breathing. I dropped my overnight bag on the floor and finally looked at my phone. Missed calls stacked down the screen. My mother, my father, my sister. The voicemails could wait. I knew every version of that script. Guilt, outrage, the reminder that my sister Kelsey's big night mattered more than anything, happening with my health. Growing up, that was the rule that never needed to be written. If there was a choice between my plans and my sister's rehearsal, her rehearsal won. I had learned to call my own fears dramatic because that's what everyone at the kitchen table called them. This time was different. I could feel it in the way my chest tightened every time I thought about skipping that appointment. There was a line somewhere inside me I hadn't known existed, and tonight I had finally stepped over it. Before I lay down, I set an alarm on my phone for the morning and checked the address for the clinic again. It felt strange and a little terrifying to plan a day that revolved entirely around my health, not my sister's schedule or my parents' emergencies. For the first time in years, I decided that tomorrow I would show up for myself, even if no one else did. Morning settled over Savannah before I felt ready to move. The alarm on my phone went off on Jordan's couch, and for a few seconds I lay still, listening to the air conditioner hum.
Then the ache in my cheek and the knot in my stomach reminded me why I wasn't in my own bed. I had a specialist appointment, and I was going to make it there, whether my family liked it or not. I washed up, pulled on clean clothes from my overnight bag, and drove across town to the clinic. The building was small and plain, wedged between a strip mall and a parking garage. Inside, I checked in, handed over my insurance card, and sat in a row of stiff chairs under a television talking about vacation spots. Around me, people came in pairs. A woman my age sat beside an older man. Another patient whispered to someone who might have been a spouse. I filled out my forms alone, circling symptoms and signing my name until it barely looked like mine. A nurse called me back and led me down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic. She wrapped the cuff around my arm, noted my blood pressure, asked basic questions, and typed without reacting to any of it. The doctor followed a few minutes later, calm and efficient, walking through my chart as if we were discussing a routine tune-up instead of my body. He asked about the exhaustion, the pains that came and went, the abnormal blood test from my regular doctor. He talked about more labs and imaging, about ruling out simple explanations before worrying about anything worse. There were no dramatic speeches, just clear instructions and another set of appointments I was expected to keep. When it was over, I left with a bandage on my arm and a handful of papers folded into my bag. The big answers would have to wait. But one thing was settled. I had finally put my own health on the calendar, and no one had managed to erase it. Back in the parking garage, I unlocked my car and my phone lit up before I could start the engine. Missed calls from home stacked down the screen, but one notification sat above them from my credit union. The subject line read, "Unusual application activity." I almost ignored it. Then I saw my full name in the email and the last 4 digits of my social security number. The email said a new line of credit had been requested in my name the previous evening. If I had not applied, I needed to call immediately. I had not filled out any applications. The only decision I had made the night before was to walk out of my parents' house. I tapped the number in the email. After a brief hold, a woman answered, introducing herself as Dawn Keller from the fraud department. Her voice was steady enough that my hands stopped shaking. She verified my identity with questions about old addresses and loan amounts, then pulled up the suspicious file on her screen. She read out the details, my employer, my parents' address, my cell number. Someone had built the application out of pieces of my life and tried to pass it off as mine. When she asked if I had submitted it, I said no. The word came out flat, but it felt like stepping through another line I could not uncross. Dawn shifted into procedure. She explained how to place a freeze on my credit so no new accounts could be opened. She told me to add fraud alerts with the major bureaus and to pull a full credit report as soon as we hung up. While we talked, I logged into the site on my phone. The report loaded in sections: accounts, balances, payment histories. Some were familiar, cards I had opened myself when money was tight. Others were strangers. A store account tied to a dancewear company I'd never used, a financing plan for sound equipment, a travel card with charges to cities that matched the stops on my sister's recent shows. Every one of them carried my name and my social security number. By the time I reached the bottom of the report, the totals on those unfamiliar lines added up to more than I had earned in several years. I stared at the totals, the bandage on my arm itching under my sleeve, and listened as Dawn outlined the next steps.
When the call ended, I stayed in the driver's seat with the engine off, my phone warm in my hand, and my lab orders on the passenger seat. In one morning, my health and my credit had both become emergencies. I could no longer postpone or sacrifice for anyone else's plans. Late in the day, the heat in Savannah pressed against my windshield as I pulled out of the clinic parking lot. The credit report was still open on my phone. Lines of debt marched down the screen beside my name. Dancewear, sound equipment, travel charges that matched my sister's show schedule. None of it belonged to me, but it all sat on my record. As long as my life was tied to that house, I was exposed. My documents, my mail, every piece of information someone could turn into another account was still sitting in their drawers. If I wanted any chance at cleaning this up, I had to start by taking those things back.
I drove to my parents' street with the air conditioning high and my jaw tight. At the front door, my key turned halfway and stopped against the locked deadbolt. I stood there, hand on the knob, then rang the doorbell. Footsteps came down the hall. The door opened a few inches. My mother filled the gap, one hand on the wood. Her eyes flicked from my face to the folder under my arm and the overnight bag on my shoulder. She did not step aside. I told her I was there for my documents and my mail, and that I would come back for the rest of my things another time. I kept my tone steady, like I was negotiating a checkout at the hotel. My father moved in behind her, looking over her shoulder. He asked why I was making a scene over finances when everything was still under one roof. He reminded me they had taken me back in after college when I could not afford my own place. I thought about the years of mortgage payments I had made and the balances I had just seen. I said there were accounts in my name that I had never authorized. I said my credit was now frozen and any new applications using my information would trigger alerts. My mother's expression hardened. She said I was being dramatic, that families used the most stable name for applications all the time, that it was easier that way. She called it family business and said dragging banks into it was a betrayal. Movement on the stairs caught my eye. My sister Kelsey leaned against the banister in rehearsal clothes, makeup half done. Annoyance flashed across her face the moment she saw me. She said this was the worst possible time for drama, that important people were watching her shows, that I was risking everything she had worked for. She did not ask why my bank thought someone was pretending to be me. I did not explain further. I had spent years justifying every decision in this hallway, and nothing had ever changed. I simply repeated that I wanted my documents and the mail with my name on it. Then I nodded toward the small table by the stairs where a stack of envelopes sat. My mother hesitated, then opened the door a little wider and stepped sideways without letting me pass the threshold. She sorted through the pile while I watched the wall behind her.
Photos of Kelsey on stage covered most of it. My own picture from college graduation was half hidden near the bottom. She shoved a bundle of envelopes into my hand so sharply that some of them bent. She said if I kept talking to banks and investigators, I should not expect to come back and find my room waiting. My father added that walking away from their support meant walking away from the family. I told them that accounts in my name were my responsibility, and that was why I would not let anyone else open or use them again. I said I would not pay for debts I had never agreed to, and I would not stay in a house where my health and identity were treated as bargaining chips. They wanted to know where I planned to go and how I thought I would manage without them. I did not offer an answer. Nothing I said would make them see me as anything but a resource they were losing. I shifted the folder higher under my arm, held the envelopes against my chest, and stepped back off the porch. The door closed with a sharp, final sound. In the car, my hands shook as I set the mail on the passenger seat. It was a thin stack, but it held what I needed to start over. Proof of who I was and the first real distance between me and the house that never treated me like a daughter. A few days later, the clinic called while I was sitting at Jordan's kitchen table. The mail from my parents' house was spread in front of me beside the credit report Dawn had helped me download. Envelopes with my name sat next to a notepad where I had started a list of accounts to dispute and numbers to call. I was trying to turn a pile of damage into tasks I could finish. When my phone lit up with the clinic's number, the room felt smaller. A nurse confirmed who I was and transferred me to the doctor. His voice stayed even as he walked through my results, mentioning markers and scans I barely understood. Then he used a word that did not need translation. He said the abnormal cells were consistent with a blood cancer that needed treatment. Rest would not fix it. Time would not quietly remove it. He outlined imaging, more labs, and a referral to an oncologist in the city. Chemotherapy was likely. He talked in terms of months. I wrote as he spoke, pressing the pen so hard it nearly tore the paper. When the call ended, the kitchen fell silent again. On the table, the list of financial steps I had made now sat beside a new column, appointments to book and documents to bring. Jordan came in from the hallway,
took one look at my face and sat across from me. I did not say the word the doctor had used, but it hung between us anyway. They asked what would happen next. I said there would be more tests and then treatment. I added that I would need time away from work and that the bills would keep arriving regardless. That afternoon, I called the number on the back of my insurance card. A representative explained deductibles, out-of-pocket maximums, and what the plan covered for oncology care. The figures were high, even with coverage. While she talked, I kept seeing the unauthorized balances on my credit report. My job at the hotel had never felt important until I realized how much I would need it. After my shift, I asked my manager, Mrs. Alvarez, for a few minutes in her office. I told her I had been diagnosed with something serious and would need flexibility for treatment. She listened without interrupting, asked what the next few months might look like, and mentioned medical leave options the company could offer. In the evenings, between shifts and phone calls, I followed the steps Dawn had outlined. I filled out identity theft affidavits, listed account numbers, and printed statements that showed purchases I had never made. I slid everything into a folder that grew thicker each night. The calls from my parents did not stop. Some messages were sharp, accusing me of turning small financial favors into crimes. Others sounded almost gentle.
My mother said the bank had called about frozen applications and closed cards. She said I had overreacted and should come back so we could fix the misunderstanding together. She did not ask how my tests had gone. My sister's voice came later in a voicemail that landed while I was folding laundry in Jordan's living room. Kelsey did not mention my health at all. She talked about directors and sponsors, about how difficult it was to explain declined payments and canceled reservations. She said people were starting to whisper that our family could not be trusted. She ended by saying I was destroying her reputation in the local arts community. Sitting on the edge of the couch, phone still in my hand, I understood something I had been avoiding. As long as everything stayed inside the family, my parents and my sister would keep treating my health and my credit as inconveniences I had created. To them, I was not a victim of fraud. I was the person making trouble by refusing to stay quiet. The next morning, I picked up the folder and drove toward downtown Savannah. Instead of turning toward my parents' neighborhood, I parked in front of a low brick building with a small sign that read, "Police." Inside, a clerk at the front counter handed me a form and asked why I was there. I said I needed to report identity theft. She slid a pen across the desk. I sat down to put the story of my life into boxes and lines on a page. When an officer called my name and led me into a smaller room to talk, I set the folder on the table between us and opened it. For years, my family had insisted our problems were private. Now, sheet by sheet, I was turning those secrets into evidence. The report did not disappear into a drawer. Within a week, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. The officer introduced himself as Detective Reed from Financial Crimes. He said my case matched other complaints tied to the same address and asked if I could come in with my documents so they could add them to the file. I took the folder back to the station and sat in another small room with a recorder on the table. Detective Reed asked when I had moved back home, who handled the bills, whose names were on which accounts. He was patient, but he did not soften the words he used. He called it fraud. He called it identity theft. Hearing those terms from someone in uniform made it harder to pretend this was just a misunderstanding. He slid a printout across the table. Transactions from one of the store accounts ran down the page. Costume orders, lighting rentals, travel bookings around Kelsey's performance states. My name sat at the top of each sheet, but the deliveries went to my parents' house and the studios where my sister rehearsed. When I left the station, the streets looked the same, but the story I had grown up with did not. From the outside, it looked like a plan. In the following days, letters began to arrive at Jordan's apartment. Creditors acknowledged my disputes and confirmed that investigations were open. Some lines of credit were placed on hold. Others were closed while they sorted out who owed the balances. At the same time, the messages from my parents shifted.
My mother left a voicemail saying collection notices had started coming to the house and accusing me of abandoning them with debt they could not handle. My father sent a text blaming me for bringing outsiders into private matters. Neither asked if I had started treatment yet. Kelsey wrote once describing a director who had pulled support for an upcoming show after hearing rumors about payment issues. She said sponsors were nervous about attaching their names to a family being questioned for fraud, and ended with a line about how some people clearly did not care if she ever made it out of local stages. Reading it, I felt the familiar pull of guilt at the edges of my resolve. For years, I had backed down at that point, telling myself that sacrificing a little more would keep the peace. This time, the numbers on my credit report and the doctor's voice on the phone left no room for that story.
At Don's suggestion, I made an appointment with a legal aid clinic downtown. The attorney there walked me through what could happen next. If the investigation found enough evidence, charges could be filed. Restitution might be ordered. There were options for setting boundaries, including orders that limited contact if harassment continued. The words sounded harsh, even though the attorney's tone stayed calm. I sat in the plastic chair and listened to someone who did not know my parents, referred to them as the alleged offenders. Part of me wanted to argue. Another part recognized that they had never hesitated to treat me as a source of money. I left with a packet of papers and the card of a victim advocate. On the sidewalk outside, I paused under a live oak and let myself breathe a little deeper. I was not standing alone in this anymore. That evening, I blocked my parents' numbers. I added filters so their emails went into a folder I did not have to open. In a short message sent before the block, I told them any questions about the accounts needed to go through the bank, the police, or an attorney. I did not wait for a reply. My days settled into a rhythm that did not belong to my family. Mornings were for labs, scans, or insurance calls. Afternoons were for work at the hotel when I felt strong enough to go in. Evenings were for rest, paperwork, and the television in Jordan's living room. One afternoon, a letter arrived in an official envelope from the county. Inside was a notice that formal charges had been filed in connection with the accounts opened under my name. My parents were listed on separate lines, each attached to counts that described exactly what they had done. I stood at the kitchen counter and followed every line. For the first time, the cost of their choices was written down in a way they could not dismiss as me being dramatic. It was no longer just my word against theirs. It was a case number now, and there was no path back to the version of family they had tried to protect. The first court date landing on a morning that looked completely ordinary. By then, chemo and lab visits had sliced my week into appointments and recovery. I moved slower, tired faster, and carried a tote with a blanket and paperwork. My body wanted sleep, but my name was on the case, so I walked into the courthouse. Showing up for myself had finally become something I would not negotiate. A clerk checked my ID and sent me upstairs. I sat on a wooden bench and found the line with my parents' names under defendant. I had seen those names on birthday cards and field trip forms my whole life. Seeing them printed there snapped any remaining illusion that this was just family business. It was now the state of Georgia versus the people who had raised me. Inside, my parents took their seats beside their attorneys. My father's shoulders looked smaller than I remembered. My mother's makeup was careful, but her hands would not stay still. My sister sat behind them alone, perfectly straight-backed, staring at the judge instead of the gallery. No one turned to look for me. The judge read the charges in a flat, practiced voice. Fraud, identity theft, using personal information without consent. The prosecutor described the pattern the detectives had traced. Applications filled out with my social security number, store cards tied to costume orders and equipment rentals, travel charges that lined up with my sister's shows, all linked back to the address where I was paying bills. When they called my name, I walked to the front and raised my hand. I confirmed which accounts I had opened myself and which I had never seen. I explained how the bills and calls started, how I pulled my credit report,
how a fraud alert arrived the same week I was scheduling chemo treatment. I kept my answers short and clear. The court didn't need every ugly sentence from my parents to understand the numbers. The judge asked what I wanted from the outcome. I said I wanted the fraudulent debts removed from my record.
I wanted money I had already paid on those accounts credited back. I wanted a written order saying no one could use my identity again without my consent. I did not ask for apologies or counseling or another chance at being a united family. A court can sign orders, not repair people. A few weeks later, both of my parents took plea deals. My father pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts and received time in county custody, followed by years of supervision and restitution. My mother admitted to several lesser charges, earning probation, community service, and the same financial obligations. The house I had helped keep afloat was ordered to be sold so the proceeds could go toward what they owed. For once, the cost of their choices landed somewhere other than my bank account and my health. After that, systems began to update. Fraudulent accounts were closed or removed from my credit report. Not every scar disappeared, but the heaviest weight finally shifted. In the hallway after sentencing, my parents walked past with officers and lawyers around them. My father stared straight ahead, and my mother's eyes slid over me without stopping. No one reached out, and I stayed where I was. In the months that followed, my sister tried to break that distance with new numbers and long messages. She wrote about canceled shows, lost sponsors, and directors in Savannah who did not want their work tied to a family with felony records. She mentioned my treatment once and then went right back to what this had done to her name. I let every message sit unanswered. Silence was the only boundary she could twist. When my lease started at a small apartment across town, Jordan and a couple of coworkers helped me move thrift store furniture and boxes. The place was plain, but every key, document, and bill belonged to me. No one else kept their paperwork in my drawers or signed their name on my lines. My health is still something I manage week by week, with good days and days I cancel everything. I no longer apologize for putting my body and my future first. I used to think walking away from your parents meant failing as a daughter. Now I know the real failure would have been staying and letting them keep spending my life on someone else's spotlight. Leaving did not make me cruel. It made me honest about what my time and health are worth. If any part of this sounds uncomfortably familiar, I hope you remember that choosing yourself is not selfish. People who truly care will learn to respect your boundaries. People who only cared about what you provided will call those boundaries betrayal. Thank you for staying with me to the end. If my story made you think about your own limits or your own family, you can share your thoughts below or pass this on to someone who might need it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, you're welcome to stay. For me, the biggest victory was not the judgment or the paperwork, but finally acting like my life belongs to me and refusing to hand that decision back.
Okay. Trash.Until. Until. Until. Until.